The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Officer Thomas Wilson sat in the back row, his casual clothes helping him blend in with the crowd. Nobody gave him a second glance, exactly how he wanted it. At 38, he'd spent the last 3 years working for Internal Affairs, the division that investigated other cops and court officials when they broke the rules. Today, his attention was focused on Judge Patricia Winters. She sat high on her bench, peering down at everyone through thin-rimmed glasses that made her eyes look bigger than they actually were. Her gray hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. 5 people had complained about her in the last month alone. Thomas shifted in his seat, careful to keep his notepad hidden. As a black officer in a mostly white county, he'd learned to move carefully through spaces where his badge wasn't visible. He'd faced plenty of sideways looks and whispered comments throughout his career, but he built a reputation for being fair and thorough. That's why his boss had chosen him for this assignment. "Next case," barked Judge Winters, slapping her gavel down even though the courtroom was already quiet. "Terrell Washington. Traffic violation." Thomas leaned forward slightly. This was his 4th time observing the judge this week, and he'd noticed a pattern. When defendants with certain backgrounds approached her bench, something in her manner changed. A young man in a pressed blue shirt and khaki pants walked down the center aisle. He stood up straight, hands clasped in front of him, the picture of respect. Thomas noted how carefully he dressed, tie knotted perfectly, shoes shined. He'd seen it many times before, the extra effort some folks felt they needed to make in these settings, hoping it might make a difference. "Mr. Washington," Judge Winters said, drawing out his name like it tasted strange in her mouth. She glanced down at the paperwork. "Says here you ran a stop sign on Maple Avenue." "Your Honor," Terrell began, his voice steady but respectful, "I came to a complete stop." "The officer were." "The officer says otherwise," the judge cut in, her voice suddenly sharp. The court recorder's fingers paused briefly over her keyboard. "Are you calling an officer of the law a liar, Mr. Washington?" Thomas watched as Terrell took a careful breath. "No, Your Honor. I just wanted to mention that I have dashcam footage from my car that shows." Judge Winters waved her hand dismissively. "We don't have time to review videos for every minor traffic infraction. The officer's testimony is clear." Terrell reached into his pocket. "I have it on my phone, Your Honor. It would only take a minute to." "Enough." The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom. "People like you always have excuses, don't you? Always some reason why the rules shouldn't apply." The courtroom fell uncomfortably silent. A few spectators exchanged glances. Even the court clerk looked up, surprised. "People like me, Your Honor?" Terrell asked quietly. The judge sighed loudly. "You know exactly what I mean. Certain communities seem to have no respect for the law until they're facing consequences." Thomas's hand tightened around his pen. This was blatant, worse than what he'd observed before. He pressed the record button on his phone, sliding it partially out of his pocket to capture the audio. Terrell stood motionless, his expression carefully controlled despite the public humiliation. He was being painted with a broad brush right in front of a roomful of strangers, and the brush was dipped in prejudice. "The fine is $300, Judge Winters said, adding, "Maybe that will help remind you to obey traffic laws in the future." It was double the standard fine. Thomas made a note of this as Terrell nodded silently, turned, and walked back down the aisle with his head held high. Thomas watched him go, feeling a familiar knot in his stomach. He'd seen enough for today, more than enough. As Judge Winters called the next case, he slipped out of the courtroom, already planning his next steps. What had been a routine observation had just turned into something much more serious. Outside in the hallway, he checked his recording and made a phone call. "Yeah, it's me," he said quietly. "I think we've got what we need. Meet me in 20 minutes. He glanced back at the courtroom doors. Judge Winters had no idea what was coming next. Thomas stepped out of the courtroom and moved quickly down the marble hallway. His heart was beating faster than normal, not from fear, but from a deep, simmering frustration. What he'd just witnessed wasn't subtle bias. It was blatant disrespect based on nothing but the color of a man's skin. He ducked into a small alcove near the water fountain and checked his recording. The judge's voice came through clearly. People like you always have excuses, and certain communities seem to have no respect for the law. Thomas shook his head. In all his years in law enforcement, he'd seen his share of prejudice, had even faced it himself, but watching someone abuse their power so openly still hit him hard. Back in the courtroom, Judge Winters had already called the next case, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. A middle-aged white woman approached the bench for another traffic violation, speeding in a school zone, a more serious offense than Terrell's alleged stop sign violation. "Mrs. Kensington," Judge Winters said, her voice notably warmer, "I see this is your first offense in our county." "Yes, Your Honor," the woman replied. "I was running late for a doctor's appointment." "I know that's no excuse." Judge Winters smiled. "Well, we all make mistakes. I'm going to reduce the fine to a warning this time. Just be more careful near schools, all right?" From his spot by the court reporter, Bailiff Rodriguez tried to keep his expression neutral, but Thomas, who had slipped back in, noticed the slight tightening around the man's eyes. The bailiff had watched this same judge slam Terrell with a double fine just minutes earlier for a lesser offense. Thomas watched as Mrs. Kensington thanked the judge profusely and left the courtroom, her relief evident. He made another note in his small notebook. The contrast couldn't be clearer. When the court took a brief recess, Thomas saw Terrell sitting on a bench in the hallway, head down, staring at the fine notice in his hands. Thomas wanted to approach him to explain who he really was and why he was there, but he couldn't risk blowing his cover. Their cases needed to remain separate for now. Instead, he watched as a young court clerk, her name tag read Lisa, approached Terrell. "I'm sorry about what happened in there," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one from the judge's office was nearby. "It's not right. It's not the first time either." Terrell looked up, surprised by the unexpected ally. "Thanks. I tried to stay calm. Didn't want to give her any reason." "I know," Lisa nodded. "Listen, if you want to file a complaint, I can tell you how." Thomas moved closer, pretending to check his phone. "Would it even matter?" Terrell asked, his voice tired. "It's her word against mine." "Maybe not just yours," Lisa replied, glancing around again. "There are people who've noticed a pattern." Thomas turned slightly away, his ears picking up every word. Lisa was exactly the kind of witness they needed, someone inside the system who'd seen the judge's behavior firsthand. Before Terrell could respond, a loud voice echoed down the hallway. "All rise. Court is back in session." Lisa quickly handed Terrell a small piece of paper. "Think about it," she whispered before hurrying back to the courtroom. Thomas watched Terrell unfold the paper. It contained a phone number and what looked like an email address. The young man stared at it for a moment, then carefully tucked it into his wallet. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text. "Got your message. Team assembled. Ready when you are." He took a deep breath and replied, "On my way. Get the paperwork ready." As he walked toward the exit, Thomas passed by the court bulletin board. A framed quote hung there, something about justice being blind. He almost laughed at the bitter irony. In Judge Winters' courtroom, justice wasn't blind at all. It saw exactly what it wanted to see. Outside, the afternoon sun felt good on his face. Thomas loosened his tie slightly as he headed for his car. What he was about to do would change lives. Terrell's, Judge Winters, and maybe even his own. But some moments called for bold action, and this was one of them. 7 minutes. That's all he needed. Thomas jogged down the courthouse steps, phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah, I'm heading to my car now," he said to Captain Richards, his supervisor at Internal Affairs. "You wouldn't believe what just happened in there." "That bad?" the captain asked. "Worse. She doubled the fine for a black man who tried to show evidence, then gave a warning to a white woman for a more serious offense 10 minutes later, all on tape." The captain let out a low whistle. "That fits the pattern. The FBI team is waiting for you at the coffee shop across from the north entrance. Agent Wilson has the paperwork ready." Thomas reached his unmarked police car, parked in a spot reserved for maintenance vehicles to avoid attention. He unlocked it and slid behind the wheel, suddenly very aware of how quickly things were moving. What had started 6 months ago as a routine investigation into a few complaints had grown into something much bigger. "I'm on my way," Thomas said, starting the engine. "Give me 5 minutes." As he drove around the courthouse to the north side, Thomas thought about the file tucked in his glove compartment. It contained printouts of bank statements showing unusual deposits to Judge Winter's personal account, always between $3,000 and $5,000, always 2 days after she had sentenced young black or Hispanic men to jail time for minor offenses. The kind of offenses that usually resulted in probation or community service for white defendants. The coffee shop was small and busy, perfect for a discreet meeting. Thomas spotted Agent Diane Wilson at a corner table, her FBI badge hidden but her confident posture giving away her law enforcement background. Next to her sat Michael Chen, the assistant district attorney who had been working with them on building the case. "Officer Baker," Agent Wilson nodded as Thomas sat down, using his undercover name. "We heard you got something good today." Thomas pulled out his phone. Better than good. Clear as day, on record. He played the audio clip, watching their expressions change as Judge Winter's comments filled the small space between them. Michael Chen shook his head. "That's not even subtle." "And not the first time," Thomas added. "But it's the clearest example we've caught, combined with the financial records and the sentencing disparities we've documented." Agent Wilson pulled a folder from her briefcase and laid it on the table. Inside was a warrant signed by a federal judge, authorizing the immediate arrest of Judge Patricia Winters on charges of civil rights violations, judicial misconduct, and accepting bribes. The U.S. Attorney signed off an hour ago, based on our previous evidence. This recording is just the cherry on top. She checked her watch. "We have a small window while she's still in court. Are you ready to lead on this, Officer Baker? It's your case." Thomas thought about Terrell Washington, about the quiet dignity he'd shown in the face of public humiliation. He thought about the dozens of other young men whose case files he reviewed, men who'd received harsh sentences from Judge Winters for minor offenses, men whose futures had been damaged by her bias. "More than ready," he replied, taking the warrant. "Let's change into something more official." In the bathroom of the coffee shop, Thomas removed his casual jacket and pulled his police uniform from his duffel bag. The familiar weight of the dark blue shirt with its badge and name tag felt right for what was about to happen. This wasn't undercover work anymore. This was justice, done in the open. As he straightened his tie in the mirror, Thomas thought about his father, who'd been a beat cop for 30 years in the same county. "The badge means nothing if you don't stand for something," his dad used to say. Today, those words felt especially true. Back at the table, Agent Wilson and Michael Chen had also prepared themselves, straightening jackets and checking credentials. They looked at Thomas expectantly. "Court reconvenes in 10 minutes, Thomas said, checking the time. "Judge Winters will be heading back from her chambers soon. We'll enter from the side door, approach the bench directly." He took a deep breath. "Let's go give the judge a little surprise." Together, they walked out into the bright afternoon sun, heading back toward the courthouse, 3 people about to change the course of many lives. The courthouse security guard did a double take when Thomas and his team approached the side entrance. Earlier, Thomas had been just another face in the crowd. Now, in his full police uniform with his badge gleaming on his chest, he was unmistakably law enforcement. "Officer Baker, Internal Affairs," Thomas said, showing his ID. "These are Agent Wilson from the FBI and Assistant District Attorney Chen. We need access to courtroom 7. The guard's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded and swiped his keycard. "Judge Winters is presiding in there today," he said, his voice low. "Something I should know about." Thomas met the man's eyes. "Just official business. Better if you don't mention our arrival to anyone just yet." Inside, they paused in the empty hallway. The distant sound of Judge Winters' voice echoed from around the corner, sharp and impatient as always. Thomas checked his watch. 2 minutes until they would enter. His heart was beating steadily, not from nervousness but from a sense of purpose. "Remember," Agent Wilson whispered, "we wait for a natural break in proceedings. No need to create a scene." Thomas nodded. They had rehearsed this. Clean, professional, by the book. That was important. When arresting a judge, everything had to be done perfectly. There could be no mistakes that her lawyers might use later. As they waited, Thomas thought about what this moment meant. He'd grown up hearing stories about justice system unfairness from his uncle, who'd spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. His uncle never became bitter, but he'd made young Thomas promise to be part of the solution if he ever got the chance. Today felt like fulfilling that promise. "We've got company," Chen whispered suddenly. Lisa, the court clerk who had spoken to Terrell earlier, was walking toward them with a stack of files. She froze when she saw the three of them standing there, her eyes darting to Thomas's uniform and then to the FBI agent's serious expression. "You're not just a visitor," she said to Thomas, realization dawning on her face. "No, ma'am," Thomas replied quietly. "Officer Baker, Internal Affairs." Lisa looked over her shoulder toward the courtroom, then back at them. "You're here for her, aren't you?" About how she treats people. Thomas didn't confirm or deny, but his expression must have given her the answer. "It's about time," Lisa said, her voice barely audible. She hesitated, then added, "She's dismissing the current case in about 1 minute. That would be your best moment to enter." Chen looked surprised. "Thank you for the information." Lisa nodded once. "I've worked for her for 3 years. I've seen a lot." With that, she continued down the hallway, her back straight, walking a little taller than before. "Looks like we have an ally," Agent Wilson murmured. Thomas could hear the change in the judge's tone that signaled the case was concluding. "Get ready," he said. He straightened his uniform, checked that the warrant was secure in his breast pocket, and took a deep breath. The courtroom doors opened, and a relieved-looking defendant exited, followed by his attorney. It was time. Thomas led the way, pushing open the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom was half full, mostly with people waiting for their cases to be called. All eyes turned to the three officials walking purposefully down the center aisle. Judge Winters was shuffling papers, not yet looking up. "Next case," she called out. But the bailiff was staring at Thomas and the FBI agent, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon before he registered their official IDs. Thomas gave him a small nod of reassurance as they continued forward. The room had fallen completely silent. Finally, Judge Winters looked up, irritation crossing her face at the interruption, then confusion, then, as she recognized Thomas from earlier that day, now in a police uniform, her expression changed to something between shock and fear. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice no longer carrying the confident authority it had held just moments before. Thomas stepped forward, the warrant now in his hand. "Judge Patricia Winters," he began, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom. "I need you to step down from the bench." Judge Winters gripped the edges of her bench, her knuckles turning white. "Officer Baker, is it?" she said, her voice dripping with forced calm. "Whatever this is about, it can wait until after my court session." Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm afraid it can't, Your Honor." He held up the warrant so she could see the official seal. "I have here a federal warrant for your arrest." A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. Someone in the back row gasped. The court reporter's hands froze over her keyboard. "This is outrageous," Judge Winters sputtered, her face flushing red. "On what grounds?" "Judicial misconduct, civil rights violations, and accepting bribes to influence sentencing." Thomas replied, his voice steady. Each word echoed in the silent courtroom. "We have evidence of a pattern of discriminatory behavior and financial transactions that coincide with unusually harsh sentences for minority defendants." Judge Winters' eyes darted around the room, looking for an alley, an escape, anything. Finding none, she turned back to Thomas. "You were here earlier," she said, realization dawning on her face. "Watching me, spying on me." "Observing," Thomas corrected. "As part of an ongoing investigation that began 6 months ago." The bailiff stood awkwardly to one side, clearly unsure what to do. His loyalties were being tested. Should he defend the judge or respect the warrant? Agent Wilson noticed his hesitation and stepped toward him, showing her FBI credentials. "This is a federal matter now, officer," she said quietly. The bailiff nodded and stepped back. In the gallery, people were pulling out phones, some recording, others texting frantically. One young woman was sketching the scene rapidly on a notepad. A court artist capturing the moment a judge became a defendant. Assistant District Attorney Chen moved forward. "Judge Winters, please step down from the bench. We'd like to handle this with minimal disruption." "I will do no such thing," she snapped, her composure cracking. "This is my courtroom. You can't just." "We can and we are." Thomas interrupted, his tone firm but not hostile. The evidence is substantial. This morning, I personally recorded you making discriminatory comments to Mr. Washington, then doubling his fine while dismissing a more serious charge against another defendant minutes later. At the mention of Terrell Washington, Judge Winter's eyes narrowed. That traffic case, that's what this is about. A simple traffic violation. Thomas shook his head. No, Your Honor. It's about dozens of cases. Hundreds, maybe. It's about a pattern of bias that has affected people's lives, their futures. It's about justice being applied differently depending on the color of a defendant's skin. For a moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the soft hum of the air conditioning. Everyone held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Then, almost imperceptibly, Judge Winter's shoulders sagged. The fight seemed to drain out of her as the reality of her situation sank in. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely audible. I want my attorney present. That's your right, Thomas acknowledged. You'll be allowed to make that call once we reach the station. The judge looked around her courtroom one last time. For 12 years, she had ruled this space like a queen. Now, in a matter of minutes, her reign was ending. I'll need to gather my things, she said, a last attempt at dignity. Agent Wilson will accompany you to your chambers, Thomas replied. But first, he walked up the steps to the bench, official papers in hand. Patricia Winters, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. As Thomas read the Miranda rights, the courtroom remained completely still. The moment felt heavy with meaning. A rare instance where the system was holding itself accountable. In the back of the room, Lisa the court clerk stood watching, her expression a mixture of sadness and relief. Next to her was Terrell Washington, who had returned to the courthouse after receiving a call from the district attorney's office. He hadn't expected to witness this scene, to see the woman who had humiliated him just hours ago now facing her own judgment. His eyes met Thomas's briefly across the room. No words passed between them, but a silent understanding did. This moment wasn't about revenge, it was about setting things right. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open as Thomas led Judge Winters out, her hands cuffed in front of her. The courthouse hallway had filled with curious onlookers, clerks, attorneys, defendants, and other judges who had heard whispers of what was happening in courtroom 7. Keep moving, Thomas said quietly, not unkindly, as the judge hesitated at the sight of the crowd. For someone who had spent years commanding respect, this public walk of shame was perhaps the harshest punishment of all. One of the courthouse security guards, an older man with graying hair, stepped forward. Do you need any assistance, officer? He asked, but his eyes were on Judge Winters, a mix of shock and something else, perhaps the realization that no one was above the law. We've got it covered, thank you, Thomas replied. Behind them, Agent Wilson and ADA Chen were speaking with the court administrator, explaining what would happen to today's docket of cases. The courthouse was buzzing like an overturned beehive, phones ringing, people whispering, doors opening and closing as news spread from room to room. As they approached the elevator, another judge, Judge Harmon, a man known for his fairness, stepped into their path. He looked at Judge Winters, his former colleague, with a pained expression. Patricia, he said softly, is there anything I can do? Judge Winters, who had been staring at the floor, looked up. Her makeup was smudged where she had wiped away tears in her chambers, but her voice was steady. Tell them I was a good judge, Robert. Tell them I served this community for 12 years. Judge Harmon's face hardened slightly. I'll tell them you served this community. Whether you served all of it equally is apparently in question. He stepped aside, allowing them to pass. The elevator ride down to the main floor was silent and tense. Judge Winters stood in the corner, her judicial robes making the handcuffs look even more out of place. Thomas kept his eyes on the changing floor numbers, giving her this small moment of privacy with her thoughts. When the doors opened on the main floor, they were met with the flash of cameras. Somehow, the local press had already gotten wind of the arrest. A courthouse this size had too many people, too many connections. It was impossible to keep something this big quiet for long. Officer, can you tell us what's happening? Judge Winters, do you have a statement? Is this related to the FBI investigation into the county courts? Thomas put his hand up, shielding the judge from the cameras as much as possible. No comments at this time. An official statement will be issued by the district attorney's office later today. They pushed through the crowd toward the side exit where a police car was waiting. The bright afternoon sun felt harsh after the dim lighting of the courthouse corridors. Judge Winters squinted against it, suddenly looking older and smaller without the height of her bench to elevate her. Just as they reached the police car, a voice called out from the courthouse steps, "Officer, wait." Thomas turned to see Terrell Washington jogging toward them, a determined look on his face. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed not on Thomas but on Judge Winters. For a moment, no one spoke. The reporters had gone quiet too, sensing that something important was happening. Even Judge Winters seemed to be holding her breath. "I just wanted to see it for myself," Terrell finally said. "I wanted to make sure this was real." Judge Winters looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Earlier that day, she had seen only what she wanted to see. A stereotype, a category, not a person. Now, with her own freedom in jeopardy, she was face to face with someone whose freedom she had carelessly dismissed. "Mr. Washington," she began, but Terrell shook his head. "I don't need an apology," he said. "I don't need anything from you. I just needed to see that the system works sometimes, even for people like me." The irony of his words, echoing her own cruel phrase from earlier, wasn't lost on anyone present. Thomas watched this exchange with mixed emotions. In his years with internal affairs, he'd seen plenty of corrupt officials brought down, but rarely had he witnessed this kind of direct confrontation between the powerful and those they had wronged. "We need to go," he said gently to Terrell after a moment. Terrell nodded and stepped back. As Thomas helped Judge Winters into the back of the police car, he couldn't help but wonder if anything had changed in her mind, if seeing Terrell as a person rather than a statistic had made any difference at all. The car door closed with a solid thunk. One chapter ending, another beginning. 3 weeks later, Thomas sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of case files. Each folder represented someone who had appeared before Judge Winters over the past 5 years. With the help of volunteers from the Public Defender's Office, they were reviewing every single one. The morning newspaper lay open beside his coffee mug. The headline still seemed unreal. "Judge Winters resigns, agrees to plea deal." The photo showed her leaving the federal courthouse, no longer in judicial robes but in a plain gray suit, her attorney at her side. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from his captain. "Press conference at 2. Be ready." He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. Since Judge Winters' arrest, he'd barely had time to breathe. The case had exploded into something much bigger than anyone expected. The initial investigation had uncovered bank accounts in 3 different states, payments from a private prison company, and troubling connections to several bail bondsmen who benefited from her harsh sentencing practices. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. Terrell Washington stood in the doorway, looking different than he had in court that day, more confident, standing taller. "Mr. Washington," Thomas said, standing to shake his hand. "Thanks for coming in." Terrell nodded, taking a seat across from the desk. "I got your message. You said there's news about my case." "Good news," Thomas confirmed, pulling a document from his desk drawer. "The district attorney's office has officially dismissed all charges against you. Your record has been cleared, including that traffic violation." Terrell took the paper, reading it slowly as if making sure it was real. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But I didn't come just for this." Thomas raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," Terrell continued. "About how many others there must be like me who went before her. People who didn't have someone like you watching out for them." "We're finding them," Thomas assured him. "Every case is being reviewed. The new acting chief judge has assigned 3 judges to handle nothing but Winters' old cases for the next 6 months. Terrell nodded, but seemed to have something else on his mind. "I've been talking to some community groups. We want to help. There are a lot of folks who don't trust the system enough to come forward, even now. But they might talk to us." Thomas leaned forward, interested. "What are you proposing?" "A partnership between your office and our community council. Regular meetings, open communication, a way for people to report problems without fear." Terrell pulled out a folder of his own, a proposal he'd clearly put thought into. We can't fix everything overnight, but we can start building bridges. As Thomas looked through the proposal, he felt a spark of hope. In his 15 years on the force, he'd seen plenty of bad actors removed, but the system itself remained unchanged. Maybe this time could be different. "I'd like to present this at the press conference today," Thomas said. "With you, if you're willing." Terrell looked surprised. "Me?" "This case isn't just about bringing down one corrupt judge. It's about changing how things work going forward. Your voice should be part of that." Later that afternoon, they stood side by side outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed as the district attorney announced the plea deal and the ongoing review of cases. When he introduced Thomas, the officer stepped up to the microphone. "What happened with Judge Winters isn't an isolated incident," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza. "It's a symptom of a system that sometimes forgets its purpose: justice for all, regardless of race, income, or background." He motioned for Terrell to join him. "Today, we're announcing a new community oversight initiative. Mr. Washington here has helped develop a program that will create real partnership between law enforcement and the communities we serve." As Terrell began explaining their plan, Thomas watched the crowd. Among the reporters and officials were familiar faces: Lisa the court clerk, Bailiff Rodriguez, other courthouse staff who had seen problems but felt powerless to address them. Now they were listening, nodding, perhaps seeing a way forward. In the back, Thomas spotted Judge Harmon, the one who had confronted Judge Winters during her arrest. He caught Thomas's eye and gave a slight nod of approval. One case had opened the door. The hard work of real change was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Thomas felt genuinely optimistic. Not because a bad judge had been removed, but because good people were stepping up to fill the gaps she left behind. Sometimes justice needed more than 7 minutes. Sometimes it needed communities willing to work together, day after day, to make it real.